Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. It's another Mission Marple day here on Books Like Whoa, so we will be talking about They Do It With Mirrors this week, which is also known as Murder with Mirrors, I believe. It was published in 1952, and this was a first read for me, which is not a frequent occurrence here in Mission Marple. So if you don't know what Mission Marple is, before I dive into things, I am doing a chronological reread of all of the Miss Marple books from Dame Agatha Christie. And what I'm doing is I'm basically reading them, giving you a plot synopsis up roundabouts to where we find a body. I won't go all the way to the body for this particular one just because of how far it is into the story. But I will give you the plot synopsis, I will get into some character details, and then I will talk about thematic things. And I like to tie it into sort of like the historical context, all that kind of stuff. If you consider any of that to be spoilers, be ye forewarned. But then after I have that main kind of what I would consider frankly to be non-spoilery discussion, I will transition into a more spoilery discussion at the end. So that's what we're going to do today with They Do It With Mirrors and preview upcoming attractions. I really like this one. This was a first read for me and a very fruitful first read. So let's dive into this. So this book kicks off with our pal, Miss Marple, visiting with a really old friend of hers named Ruth Van Rydick, I think is her married last name. Doesn't really matter. Basically, she's Ruth, and the reason why Miss Marple primarily knows her as Ruth is because they were schoolgirls together in Italy. Ooh la la, how glamorous. And Ruth is an American who has been living in America her whole life, but she also has a sister that both of them were in school with as well, named Carrie Louise, and Carrie Louise is an American who has spent her entire adult life in the UK. So Ruth is really worried about this sister, and she's basically called Miss Marple to a meeting or whatever. She's getting some dresses fitted, and it's like, hey, I'm having this sort of just like premonition that something is really wrong with Carrie Louise. The last time I was there, I just got a vibe that something is off, and I'm worried about her. Like, I'm worried about something happening to her. Would you mind going to check it out? And basically she's told Carrie Louise that Miss Marple is really hard up for money, and she could probably use some generosity in the form of being allowed to visit Carrie Louise at her big house, which we'll get to here in a minute. So she's kind of played both sides of the fence and arranges it so that Miss Marple can go stay with Carrie Louise. Now, things you should know about Carrie Louise. She's a very lovely, caring, kind person. She is rich, and she's also been married to men of various levels of wealth. So her first husband, who she was very attached to and was much older than her, had 2 sons already. He also had a daughter with Carrie Louise, and then they adopted another girl. So like 4 kids total in that family. He dies. Her next husband eventually leaves her for another woman, but she keeps his son. So she has 2 other kind of adopted sons from her second marriage, and she is now married to a third guy. Each of them is described basically as being some version of a crank, and in this world, a crank is having some sort of like special affiliation with a charitable cause. So her first husband turned the estate that he had, Stony Gates, into a school for impoverished children. Her second husband was really invested in being a patron of the arts, and her current husband has used Stony Gates, instead of being kind of a school for poor children, as being a place for juvenile delinquents or young people with like mental problems and helping them get back on their feet. So we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, that's kind of the setup, and those are all of the family members involved. So Miss Marple agrees to go stay with Carrie Louise, who's very happy to see her, and she starts kind of poking around trying to get a sense of why Ruth might be having this feeling of foreboding and figuring out if Carrie Louise is in fact in danger in some way. And let's just say, because I feel like the actual murderousness doesn't happen until well into the story, but I think you've been introduced to most of the characters. Just also know that there's a lot of like the actual juvenile delinquents who are being helped. They're around. There's a lot of like psychiatrists and teachers and stuff around as a part of that institution. And eventually we find out if Ruth was right and why and where all of the danger might be coming from. So that's kind of the overall synopsis and some character stuff. So let's talk about some themes. So I think I should just say, to start off with, I really liked this book. So I know that it's not a favorite for a lot of people, and I'm not going to argue that it's like a great Christie. I think it just happened to be a combination of a lot of things that I personally like in Christie and things that we don't get as much of in the Marple canon as we do in the Poirot canon, which is a part of why I've always tended to prefer the Poirot canon. Namely, I really like a country house Christie mystery. And there's just not that many of those in Marple, because Marple tends to be much more of like a village life setting as kind of the backdrop. And don't get me wrong, I think Christie does that really well, and it's very charming in a lot of ways. It's just not my favorite version of Christie. My favorite version of Christie is like a bunch of people in a country house, someone dies, and you kind of figure out what happened. And it doesn't have to be like a locked room mystery, and it doesn't have to be like a isolated house thing, but I just like that kind of country house setting and the idea of like a weekend party kind of thing. So anyway, all that to say, this is like one of the closest things we get in Marple to that kind of setting, which I think contributed a lot to my personal enjoyment. I also really did like kind of the cast of characters that gets set up here, and it is quite a large cast, so I'm not really going to get into too many details about that other than when I need to for thematic reasons. But anyway, all that to say, I think the characterization is really good. I really like the setting. I really like that this is a full Miss Marple book, meaning that she is in it from beginning to end, because that is something that we don't always get, and when that doesn't happen, I feel pretty disappointed in it. So I liked everything about that part. The actual mystery in this, I think, is pretty weak. If you have read much Christie, I think you will know a lot about the who and how as soon as murder starts to factor in. Like, I think you'll have a pretty solid bit of that. You may not know why, but you will definitely, I think, have some ideas about how the mechanics of it work. So for that reason, I totally understand why people don't necessarily love this one, but I personally just really enjoyed it. And even though I knew a lot of the mechanics, I still felt like there was somewhat of a little bit of like, I'm not totally sure why. I found that the finding out of why was very enjoyable. So I personally really like this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I'm probably gonna say I would put it right under The Body in the Library at this point in my reread, which I think would be kind of surprising to some people. But aside from that, in terms of some of the themes beyond just like my own enjoyment of it, I did really enjoy some of her exploration of what a premonition is, and if that is supernaturally or naturally based. So Ruth, at the beginning of this novel, has like some sense that something is wrong, and I think that there's a little bit of interesting ambiguity as to whether or not that is valid, or if it is something that she has like women's intuition about, or as Miss Marple ultimately kind of says, that she just subconsciously has processed something and is like sublimating that into why she has a bad feeling about things. But I think there's a lot of discussion in this about sort of like women's intuition and like intuition in general that I think is pretty interesting. So yeah, I liked all of that. I like it when Christie kind of plays with what are natural explanations for supernatural phenomenon. Like, I always think that's an interesting kind of interplay in Christie, because she is somebody who very much always sides on the kind of more scientific or materialistic explanations for things. She tends to be pretty suspicious of religion and of supernatural things in her books. And speaking of that, we get ye old blood will tell theme back in this book. We haven't seen it much in the Marple canon. It is all over Poirot, and it definitely is back in this one. And I enjoyed being like, oh, she's back on her hobby horse. And I think that some of that is that from the 50s onwards, she really is very into the whole blood will tell thing. But I think that that factors into her own kind of a sense of herself as somebody who wants to have like scientific explanations for things, or like natural explanations for things. And I think she sees genetics being the king of our behavior. I think she has a lot of interest in that topic, and that definitely is emerging in this book. I think in particular, it's interesting to think about that as a theme with respect to one of the juvenile delinquents who is featured very prominently. His name is Edgar, and he has these delusions about who his father is, and is talking about it being Winston Churchill or Lord Montgomery or all these other people. And I think that when you kind of see how that whole bit wraps up, that's an interesting contrast to, for instance, Carrie Louise's adopted granddaughter Gina, who is half Italian. There's a lot of discussion about how her Italianness impacts her, and also how her actual biological mother's character impacts her. So I think you could come to some interesting conclusions about blood will tell and how that is actually manifesting in her characters. So I don't know, maybe she's complicating her own presentation of Blood Will Tell. But I thought that was just like a huge theme in this. I also found just some of the discussion of like older women and their financial situation and some of the choices that they've made in their life reminded me a lot of Cranford. Like, that's totally just me having read Cranford in the last year and thinking about that book. But just as a side note, I think I'm somebody who's very interested in that kind of thematic content in a book in terms of like women and what kind of choices that they have in different periods of history vis-a-vis, can they make their way through work? Do they have to rely on a man? If they have to rely on a man, what kind of man? Like, I just find all of that really interesting. So thematically, that was something that really worked for me in this book, and I liked it. And before I move into spoilers, I also just wanted to mention briefly that when talking about premonitions, Miss Marple mentions the fact that in St. Mary Mead, she had a premonition about this girl being in danger. She didn't know why. And turns out later that girl's father tried to kill her with a hammer. St. Mary Mead's is a terrifying place of nightmares that nobody should ever go. It might look cozy, but like, it is savage AF. So with all that being said, I'm gonna transition into spoilers now. So overall, like I said, this is one that I really liked. I don't think it's a great Christie, but it's just one personally that really connected for me. So I would recommend, like I said, I think I would probably put it below The Body of the Library at this point in the reread. But yeah, I really enjoyed this as a first read, much more so than I did The Moving Finger, even though I would agree that empirically The Moving Finger is a better book. So getting into spoilers, a few things I just wanted to highlight. One is that as soon as this mystery got started, I kind of zeroed in pretty quickly on who I was sure was involved. I knew the husband was going to be involved. I could just tell from the way he was being characterized. I knew Edgar was going to be involved. I could just tell. And then I thought that this was going to be like a Mysterious Affair at Styles kind of thing, where the housekeeper was also in on it, because I think that was the vibe in terms of like the rich older woman and her husband who might be taking advantage of her for money. Like, I think that was the vibe I was getting from this, and that's why I was able to quickly identify who did it. Then in terms of the mechanics, I mean, as soon as you got two people behind a locked door and like having some sort of very seemingly staged argument happening, I mean, Death on the Nile, Dead Man's Folly, like there was a few of them that I was like, I really feel like we're in the middle of a bait and switch right now. And we were like, and then also in the title, the idea of they do it with mirrors and like the theme of magicians and like misdirection, it's laid on pretty thick, which I think really undercuts the suspense of the mystery. So on a technical level, I completely agree with people who have a problem with this one, because I think that if you read any Christie, you're immediately clued in as to the fact of like when the murder is taking place. Now, the thing I did like was that in terms of the motive, I was thinking that Lewis was wanting to kill her, and there was some reason that we didn't know about why he was trying to set it up so that he could kill her. So I actually quite liked that that was a misdirection and that ultimately he really was just trying to kill Christian. So I thought that that was handled well, and I found that like a satisfying motive twist. But I just wanted to say that I totally agree with anybody who has a problem with this at a mechanical level, because I just don't think it's one of her best. But for me, there were enough other interesting things happening that I was willing to overlook that. And then I should say the other weakness I think that we see in this book is that it's very info dumpy in the beginning when you're meeting all the characters. Like literally there's a section where Marple is like just having characters come up to her and like give her their backstory and motive and stuff. So like that didn't work so well for me. The other subversion that I wanted to mention was that I quite liked that at the end, Gina does go back to her husband to America. I'm not quite sure what that says, but I kind of like that ultimately Christie is giving this sort of class mismatch and wealth mismatch. So she's kind of like signing off on it. I don't think we always see that in Christie, so I sort of liked that ultimately she does have them come back together. So yeah, thematically that's sort of some of the stuff that I found interesting, and like I said, not technically one of her best, but one that I did enjoy. So anyway, those are my thoughts on They Do It With Mirrors / Murder with Mirrors. It was a good read for me, one of my favorites to date, and I will say, guys, I'm at this point 6 books in, really enjoying the Marple books so much more than I remember enjoying them. Now, looking at the ones we have coming up, I do think we have some weak ones coming here in a few books, and so maybe that was sort of dominating my memory, or maybe as I'm older, I'll be able to appreciate them more. But so far, I'm really kind of proving my initial impression of Marple wrong, which was that they were sort of like fussy and boring a little bit, like as compared to Poirot. I don't know, maybe because she wrote fewer of them, the ones that she did write tend to be stronger, whereas she wrote a lot of Poirots, so there's more mismatch on quality. I don't know, but I've not given any of these so far less than a 3.5 star, and spoilers, I won't again next week. So yeah, this is like it's good times so far, guys. All that being said, definitely let me know what you thought of this book if you're reading along. You should definitely go hang out with us over in the Goodreads group. We're doing kind of like spoilery discussions over there, so I'll have that information listed below. But yeah, aside from that, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.